Welcome. This is Mishnah in Depth, Nazir Sotah with Rabbi Avie Walfish. This is a continuation of our ongoing Mishnah in Depth series, which is part of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein division, sponsored by the family of Rifka Rosenwein in her memory as a lifelong lover of Mishnah. This class continues the Nazir Sotah series with Rabbi Walfish, who we've had the pleasure of learning with before, and at this point needs very little introduction, but we're very glad to have him teaching today. And with that, I want to hand over the mic to him, and I will post links to sheets in chat momentarily.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Okay, we're going to start Masechet Sotah this evening, but as I promised, we will make a few concluding remarks about Tractate Nazir, which we have been studying, and which we more or less concluded last night, but didn't quite finish. We were looking at Chapter 9, the final chapter of Tractate Nazir, and we talked about 2 or 3 major themes in the chapter. Chapter opens with the question, which people can take a vow of Nazirut as far as the halacha is concerned. And we saw that all Jews, including women and even slaves who are considered to be part of the Jewish people on a certain level, they can take a vow and become Nazirim. The ones who cannot are non-Jews, and we talked about how even though this is a Mishnah that we might expect at the beginning of the tractate, when it appears at the end of the tractate, perhaps gives us a sense that the sanctity of the Nazir is something that is reserved for people who are part of the Israelite nation. And perhaps that's why this is at the conclusion of the tractate, after chapters that very much emphasize the sanctity of the Nazir, even to the point of wondering whether a Nazir in certain cases might take precedence over a Kohen Gadol, a high priest. That was one point. We also noted that the appearance of women at the end of the tractate once again ties in Tractate Nazir to the Seder Nashim, which is mostly about matters relating to marriage, relationships between men and women. So Tractate Nidarim, we saw the theme of women and familial relationships is central throughout Tractate Nidarim, and in Masechet Nazir it's less central, but coming here at the end, not only that women can take Nazirut, but that their husbands can annul the vow, which is a part of the familial context of vows in general, and we see Nazirut fits into that as well. So that might be one of the reasons. Then we saw a series of Mishnayot, starting with a unique halacha of Nazir, of Tumat HaTahom, that a Nazir unwittingly is exposed to impurity, and he finds out about it later. So if it's Tumah that no one knew about in advance, and if the Nazir finds out that he'd become defiled only after he underwent the process of shaving his head and concluding his Nazirut, so then, very unusually, this is regarded halachically as a halacha l'Moshe Misinai, since no one knew about it and the Nazir had no way of knowing about it. So once he's already done the procedure to end his Nazirut, even though it turns out that it was, as it were, under false pretenses, because he was actually not capable of doing that had he known that he was impure. But that's the special halacha of Nazirut. We talked about Tumat HaTahom, and particularly in relation to the Tumah of the dead, is perhaps indicating some connection between Nazirut and the mystery. Here it's not only the mystery of death, which the Nazir generally has to avoid, but here it's also the mystery of not even having known that he came into contact with it. Okay, so perhaps the sanctity of the Nazir has something to do with his relationship to the mystery of death, and the mystery of death being in places where you don't expect it, and where you might not even know you've encountered it. Okay, and maybe that has something to do with the fact that personal sanctity always brings a person in touch with the infinite, okay, with God, who is infinite. On the one hand, you're coming close to a very special and fascinating and beckoning realm, and on the other hand, you realize how far removed human beings are from the Almighty, from the Eternal. Okay, and and so this aura of mystery is perhaps related to that. Then when the Mishnah details how exactly does Tumat HaTahom work, so the Mishnah also brings a case where the Nazir is uncertain, did he or did he not come into contact the dead. We also, I'll just review also that the next to last chapter of Nazir also it focuses on safek, on doubt. Okay, so the limits of human knowledge, okay, seem to be a very central theme here towards the end of Nazir. But then we're given a way of figuring out, under certain cases, which the details which we can't get into, the Nazir has tried to purify himself in a cave, and then there's a corpse floating there, and the Nazir wonders, did I come into contact with him? So under certain circumstances, we assume he did, because raglayim ladavar. Okay, because sometimes we can answer our safek by relying on probabilities. Raglayim ladavar means there is a basis in reality which entitles us to assume that this is the way it played out. And then a series of Mishnayot, which all but conclude Masechet Nazir, all about Raglayim Ledavar. First of all, about graves. You find a grave. Are there other graves in the area? It's not a marked cemetery. Find in the middle of a field. Well, do I have to worry that maybe there are other graves in the field? So the Mishnah describes how I should go a certain distance based on the size that graves are supposed to have in halacha. So you go that distance, you dig again, you find another body, so then you have to act accordingly. And once you have found a certain number of graves, we say raglayim ladavar. You have to assume that this is probably a place that has at some point been used as a burial grounds, even though it's not marked off as such. Raglayim ledavar. Then we apply raglayim ledavar to cases of tuma of sara'at, tuma of ziva, certain kinds of genital flows that are not the normal kind. Okay, today we often identify it with gonorrhea. Okay, so that has certain laws in halacha, and here again, in a certain constellation, we apply the principle of raglayim ledavar. And then finally, we come back Okay, so we've talked about tuma of death. Then we come to two other kinds of serious forms of tum'ah, tzara'at, which has played a role elsewhere in Tractate Nazir, ziva, which is something new and seemingly unrelated, and then we come back to death, but from a different angle. Now we're talking not about what happens when you encounter death, but what happens when you cause death. Okay, so that's where we're going to pick up now in the next to last Mishnah of Nazir of chapter 9. Okay, yeah, maybe I should get this up. Yeah, let's get the Svaria up here. Okay, people see the Svaria up on the screen? I have to.
No, I think you need to
Yeah,
stop
okay, yeah.
there and share a different window.
Right, okay. I'll
Not yet.
get it up. Okay, now you should see it, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. The end of Mishnah Dalid. Hamaket chavero v'amaduhu lemita ve'kel mima shaya. Lachar mikan hichbid umet chayav. Rabbi Nechemia omer patur sheraglayim ladavar. Okay, so a person strikes his fellow, and the doctors evaluate the victim and determine that that he has only a short while to live. Okay, so according to halacha, murder is not only if the person dies right away. Even if the person lingers before dying, then the person is regarded as a murderer. However, the Torah describes this in Parashat Mishpatim. However, if the person seems to be recovering and then gets worse, as a person, as the Torah describes, the person gets up and walks around. So then we say, okay, obviously this was not murder. Okay, now what happens if he gets up and walks around and then seems to get worse, and then he dies? So that's pretty much the case that we have here. Okay, hekel mima shehaya. Okay, we'll see this in the English. Okay, his health improved from what it was, and then v'hichbid umeit. Afterward, his condition worsened, and he died. Right, hichbid umeit. So the Tanakama says chayav. Okay, he's a murderer. Rabbi Nechemia omer patur sheraglayim ladavar. Okay, since he got up afterwards and he was moving around and he seemed to be recovering, so raglayim ladavar, that his death must have been due to some other factor. So we're again applying raglayim ladavar, but this time not to matters of impurity as in all the previous cases. We're applying raglayim ladavar in this case to whether the death was caused by the blow, and therefore whether this is murder or not, and we have a dispute on that point. Here it's only Rabbi Nechemia who thinks that raglayim ladavar.
Excuse me. Till
Yes.
now, we've been saying that raglayim ladavar has to do with probability, that it's likely.
Yeah.
But how does that apply in this situation here? What was likely?
Okay, what was likely is that the death was not caused by the blow. Because had the death been caused, the assumption, Rabbi Nechemia's assumption is that the things a person's condition in these situations should move in a straight line. Okay, if the blow caused the death, he should keep on deteriorating until he dies. And
In
if
other
at
words,
some point
in other
he's
words, the
recovering,
default.
what?
In other words, like the default.
That's right. Raglaim ledavar is basically your default assumption. Okay, what you are entitled to assume, given how we know that reality normally operates. Okay, Raglaim ledavar always means if you see how reality normally operates, so you're entitled to assume that's the way it operates here as well. This is not an exception to the normal way that the world operates. Okay, but it does really stand out from the others. Again, it has to do with death, but from a completely different angle. It's not the Tumah v'Torah aspect of death, but actually the punishment aspect for the one who caused the death. Okay, we'll come back to this Mishnah in a bit. But first, let's look at the last Mishnah. Nazir haya Shmuel. Shmuel the prophet was a Nazir, kedivrei Rabbi Nahorai. Shenamar umora lo yale al rosho. Okay, this is part of the neder that Chana took. Okay, Chana, when she was praying for a child, she said, if you give me a child, then unetativ l'Hashem kol yimei chayav, I will give him to Hashem for his entire life. Umora lo yale el rosho. Okay, which is normally translated. Okay, mora would be a synonym for a razor. No razor shall ever touch his head. Okay. Okay, now let's skip over Ne'amar. Oh, no, we shouldn't skip over. Ne'amar b'Shimshon u'morav, Ne'amar b'Shmuel u'morav. Ma mora b'Shimshon Nazir, af mora b'Shmuel Nazir. Regarding Shimshon as well, Shimshon's mother is told by the angel that she should avoid having any wine or grape products during her pregnancy, because the child she will bear, okay, will be a Nazir from birth, umora lo yalel rosho. And clearly in that context, mora lo yalel rosho means that his hair shall never be cut. Now, of course, we know from Shimshon's biography that that was a central part of his identity, not to have his hair cut. As long as his hair wasn't cut, he was powerful, and the Philistines couldn't vanquish him. When he enabled Delilah to cut his hair, he lost his power, and he was subdued by the Plishtim. In captivity, his hair grew long again, and he brought the house down on the Plishtim, right? So Shimshon not cutting his hair is very, very central. And the source for it is umora lo yalel rosho. So just as mora lo yalel rosho for Shimshon means he was a Nazir, so too, argues Rabbi Nahorai, Shmuel must have been a Nazir as well. Okay, because the same term applies, even though Shimshon, it explicitly says he was a Nazir. For Shmuel, nowhere does it ever explicitly say that he was a Nazir. But what it does say is mora lo yalel rosho. I would add, perhaps Rabbi Nahorai is also influenced by unitativ l'Hashem kol yimei chayav. How do you give your child to God? How do you sanctify your child to God? So perhaps Rabbi Nahorai thinks to have this lifelong sanctification to God means to be a lifelong Nazir. Of course, we know from the story of Chana and Shmuel that he was sanctified to God by being brought to the Mishkan and serving there under the Kohen Eli. but perhaps to be sanctified for his entire life would not mean that. At least that's the way Rabbi Norai would reason, because a Nazir is sanctified to God. Okay, all of this is the opinion of Rabbi Norai. Amar Rabbi Yosei, valo ein mora ela shel basar v'dam. He says the term mora usually means fear. He will never fear will never go upon his head. Okay, he will never be afraid of any flesh and blood. He will be fearless. No human being will ever frighten him. Now, we would normally tend to agree with Rabbi Norai, if only because the word morah, to meaning fear, is normally written with an aleph, and here it's written with a hey. And in the case of Shimshon, it's written with a hey. So I think Rabbi Norai has a strong case here, but that is the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, and Rabbi Yosei brings an argument. Rabbi Norai not only, I think, has linguistically a stronger argument, but he also has a counter argument to Rabbi Yosei. Okay, I'll take the question in just a minute. Amar lo Rabbi Norai v'lo kvar ne'emar vayomer Shmuel echelech v'shama Shaul v'haragani shekvar haya alav morah shel basar v'dam. Okay, when Shmuel is instructed to go anoint a new king after he has informed Shaul that because he failed to completely obliterate Amalek, his kingdom will be torn away from him. So God instructs Shmuel, go to the house of Yishai and anoint one of his sons to be king. And Shmuel says, how can I go? If Shaul hears it, he will kill me. Well, he had fear of flesh and blood. He was afraid of Shaul. So how can you tell me, Morah lo yalel rosho, it's a prophecy, he will never fear flesh and blood, when his biography later shows that he did indeed fear flesh and blood, and therefore, Rabbi Norai says, therefore my reading must be correct. My reading is that Shmuel was in fact a Nazir. Okay, someone had a question? Yes, Nathan.
Hello. It's not a question. It's just, yeah, I'm in the Targum. Yonatan reads it as that Shmuel was not a Nazir, but I am also sympathetic to Shmuel being a Nazir.
Yes. Okay. Right. Okay. I mean, we have the two opinions right here in front of us in the Mishnah, and it's not surprising that the commentators, you note already in the Targumim, which is an interesting point, but commentators will also reflect these two possible readings. Okay, let's first of all note something structural. When we say Shmuel was a Nazir, and how do I know Shmuel was a Nazir? Because Shimshon was a Nazir. And the same term that the Torah uses, that the Tanakh uses for Shimshon, the Tanakh also uses for Shimshon. Okay, so it seems clear that Shmuel had a similar status to Shimshon. I think it bears noting also, and this might also relate us back to the setting in Seder Nashim. In both cases, both Shmuel and Shimshon, the source of the Nazirut was the mother. Even though there was a Mishnah that we learned earlier that a father can impose Nazirut upon his children, and not a mother, nevertheless, the two most famous Nazirim, at least according to Rabbi Norai, the two most famous Nazirim that we know of in the Tanakh, were both Nazirim due to the mother. Shimshon because that was the command the mother received. Chana because that's the vow that the mother took. Okay, so I think that's another interesting tie-in between the two figures. But I want to look at this structurally. Okay, we've encountered Shimshon already. Where have we encountered Shimshon? In Tractate Nazir.
At the beginning, when we talked about the different Naziris.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's take a look at chapter 1.
Right.
Okay, chapter 1 of Nazirut. Okay, still discussing the language. That's the opening of Tractate Nazir. The languages. And what if you use an incomplete language? Okay, or an elusive language, elusive with an A. Okay, language. The same way that Tractate Nidarim opened with those topics, Tractate Nazir opens in a very similar fashion. And one of the examples is Hareini Kishimshon, or Kiven Manoach, or Kival Delilah, or Kamisha Kardal Totaza. And then the Mishnah says, there is something called Nazir Shimshon. It's a special kind of Nazir status. And it differs from the status of Nazir Olam. Okay, in that the Nazir Shimshon, okay, even if Hichbid Sa'aro Eino Mekel, even if his hair gets heavy, he can't lighten it, as opposed to the Nazir Olam. He's a lifetime Nazir, but when his hair gets heavy, Hichbid Sa'aro Mekel Betar, he does lighten it. So right near the beginning of the tractate, we encountered Nazir Shimshon. Shimshon was the model for a certain kind of Nazirut that appears right at the beginning of the tractate. And now we jump to the end of the tractate and Shimshon reappears. But this time he has a partner. His partner is Shmuel. Okay, so this phenomenon that the tractate opens and closes with two texts that are clearly associated with one another has a name. Anyone know the technical name for this phenomenon? You open and close a literary unit with connected items that connect associatively or thematically.
Is that an envelope?
Good. It's called an envelope structure. Scholars like to use the Latin name for it, inclusio. Okay, inclusio. Talmud actually was familiar with this phenomenon. The Talmud notes this phenomenon in certain chapters of Tehillim. Okay, chapters of Tehillim can open like that. Like saw a famous example that we say every day. In fact, more than once every day. We call it Ashrei. Okay, but Ashrei actually opens. Okay, the pasuk Ashrei is actually from a different chapter. Okay, but the chapter itself, chapter 145, opens with Tehillah LeDavid and closes with Tehillat Hashem Yedaber Pi. Okay, it opens with and close with Tilat Hashem Yidaber Pi, Yivarech Kol Basar Shem Kodsho Leolam Va'ed. Right? So the opening and closing of that chapter are clearly strongly connected. Okay, that's your inclusio. It's a very common phenomenon in the Mishnah. And you see the whole tractate is framed by this inclusio. Shimshon at the beginning, Shimshon and Shmuel at the end. We can take this a step further though, because we noted when we looked at Shimshon, the Mishnah doesn't just call him by name Shimshon. The Mishnah also characterizes him as the son of Manoach. Okay, that's pretty neutral. As the husband of Delilah. as the one who uprooted the entry doors to Aza. Okay, perhaps a sign to Am Yisrael in these days. Okay, as the one who, okay, that was done, by the way, when he went to have a fling one evening with a prostitute in Aza, and the Philistines gathered around the city. They said, okay, we've got him this time. He's not going to escape. So they surrounded the city so that he would have no way of escaping. So what did he do? He picked up the gates and carried them all the way to Hebron. Okay, so this is certainly an instance of his great power, but certainly from a moral standpoint, not the finest hour of his life. Okay, just like the husband of Delilah. Okay, certainly not a badge of honor. The one whose eyes were put out by the Philistines. Okay, the Mishnah is telling us something about Shimshon. We noted this when we started the Masechet. Shimshon is not the most admirable character in the Tanakh. Yes, he is a Nazir. Does that make him a righteous, pious person? Not necessarily. He's a Nazir. That gives him a certain power. That gives him a certain connection to God. It doesn't necessarily indicate that he is the most righteous individual on earth. Far from it. He's a flawed character. Okay? He's a Nazir, but he's flawed. Now, does that tell us something about Nazirut? Is Nazirut a good thing? The beginning of the tractate, we discussed that at some length, and we saw that there are different schools of thought, and the Mishnah is not unequivocal on the topic either. There are some indications in the Mishnah that Nazirut is not such a positive phenomenon, just as Nidarim is certainly presented as a negative phenomenon. Although he's also sanctified, he has sanctity, maybe even superseding that of a Kohen Gadol. So it's hard to say unequivocally that the Nazir is a negative character. But the tractate opens with Shimshon, who is clearly portrayed in a less than positive light. But then, when we come to the last chapter, we discover another Nazir, Shmuel, who is clearly a very, very positive character, perhaps the greatest of all of the Nevi'im. Shmuel is definitely regarded very, very highly by the Tanakh. So to close Masechet Nazir with Shmuel, we opened with Shimshon, perhaps casting the Nazir in a negative light. And we close the tractate with Shmuel also being a Nazir, which tells us that maybe a Nazir can really be a very holy, righteous person and a very important leader of the people. Shimshon was not only flawed as an individual spiritually, he was also flawed as a leader. He actually never led. He carried out one-man operations, very, very successful one-man operations. Okay, he clearly, from a military point of view, he clearly helped keep the Philistines at bay during his lifetime and even in his death. But at the same time, he wasn't a leader. We don't find him leading the people, not spiritually and not even militarily. Shmuel was a military leader. Shmuel was not just a great individual, he was a great leader. He led the people into battle against the Philistines and defeated them. Okay, so there seems to be this kind of movement in Tractate Nazir from a negative perspective on the Nazir through Shimshon, or a positive evaluation. Of course, the positive evaluation depends on accepting the opinion of Rabbi Naharai. According to Rabbi Yosei, we don't have that balance. Okay, Shimshon was a Nazir, Shmuel was not. So we don't have a positive figure to rely on, according to Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Naharai seems to get the last word in Tractate Nazir, so I think we can safely assume that the redactor wants to emphasize his point of view. There's another interesting connection between the beginning and end of the tractate. Look at the language here at the beginning of the tractate. Hichbid sa'aro mekel betar. If his hair gets heavy, so the Nazir Olam can mekel, can lighten the load, and the Nazir Shimshon cannot, even when his hair gets heavy. Does that remind you of something we saw towards the end of the tractate? No takers?
Avshalom.
Okay.
Avshalom.
We didn't see Avshalom in the tractate, but yes, we did note that Avshalom seems to be alluded to there at the beginning, another very negative figure. If Avshalom is being alluded to at the beginning of the tractate as a Nazir, so once again, we're associating Nazirut with things that are rather negative. But where do the terms appear again at the end of the tractate? Let's go back to the next to last Mishnah. Hamaket chavero v'amaduhu lemita vehekel mima shehaya lachar mikein hichbid umeit. Now notice, we're not using the terms in the same way. We're using the terms now in a metaphoric sense, in a figurative sense. We're not talking about physically heavy. The situation is light,
Improving.
or the situation is heavy. His situation has been alleviated, has been
Improving.
lightened. Right. It's a figure of speech for improvement. And hichbid means his situation worsened.
Right.
So it's a word play, but it's the same term.
Got
The
it.
same terms that appeared at the beginning of the tractate in connection with the difference between Nazirut Shimshon and Nazirut Olam reappear at the end of the tractate in connection with murder. Very strange. Now, why we have these illusions, we can only speculate. Okay, sometimes you see literary connections and the meaning of it leaps out at you. This is a case where you have to do some creative thinking, and I'm not sure that that any creative idea we come up with is necessarily what the Mishnah redactor intended, but I'll throw something out. Okay. Let's remember that both Shimshon and Shmuel killed human beings. Let's remember that the term morah was understood by Rabbi Yosei to mean not to be afraid of people. So perhaps there is an idea here, that there is a connection between killing people and Nazirut. Somehow Nazirut qualifies you to be someone who is not afraid of people, which of course by extension means you are afraid of God. You're close to God, therefore you're not afraid of people. Therefore, you can vanquish the enemies of Israel. You can do it the way Shimshon did, which is problematic. You can do it the way Shmuel did, which is admirable. Shimshon did it as one-man forays into Philistine territory, which was only partially effective. Shmuel did it as a leader of the people, who led them spiritually as well as militarily. And that's admirable. So maybe we have these two models of Nazir. The Nazir who is set apart, who is consecrated to God, and who therefore can also vanquish the enemies of Israel. Perhaps that's an idea that the Mishnah had in mind. And one further thought on this topic comes out of a discussion about this last Mishnah in the Yerushalmi. Here's the text of the Yerushalmi. Amar Rabbi Yanai, Ktiv v'chol ha'arim asher b'ma'ader yehadrun lo tavo shama yirat shamir v'shayit. Okay, this is a description by the Navi Yeshayahu of desolation of Israel at a certain point. But the term that interests the Yerushalmi is yirat shamir v'shayit. Okay, that the produce is fearful of that which can cut it down. Whatever can cut down the produce is fearful of it. So now the Yerushalmi concludes, the Midrash concludes, Ma'adein bizra dachil min hadein parzala, just as the produce is afraid of iron, af hadein sa'ara dachil min hadein parzala. Hair is also fearful of iron. What is that saying? Okay, think of mora lo ya'aleh al rosho. The hair is fearful of being cut. Cutting the hair perhaps is symbolically attacking the person. We talked last time about about sacrificing the hair as being a form of self-sacrifice. Well, maybe also growing the hair is an expression of personhood, who you are, what you are. And when you grow your hair consecrated to God, that is dedicating your person to God. And the hair should not be fearful of the iron. Okay, in other words, the hair shouldn't be cut. There's somehow a connection here between cutting the hair and injuring the person. The Nazir refuses to use iron even on his hair. And that enables him to employ iron against his enemies. He has no fear on his head. Therefore, he can combat the enemies fearlessly. So perhaps there's something symbolic here about growing the hair that indicates why a Nazir is somehow qualified to function as a military leader. Okay, I've thrown out the idea. It needs to be thought about more. Maybe the Mishnah is going in a completely different direction, but I hope I've left you with something to think about. And I think part of the point of studying any source, and Mishnah in particular, is you don't have to have all the answers. And being left with a good question can sometimes be better than being left with a better or worse answer. So I hope I've left you with some interesting questions, maybe with some good answers as well, and we'll move on to Tractate Sotah.
Can I ask you some questions?
We're
No?
maybe at the end of the session because
Okay.
We're running a bit behind time. Okay, so the passage of Sotah that you have up here on your screen right now, okay, we won't read through it in detail. We'll look at 2 or 3 psukim from the passage just to help us focus on why this is a very challenging section of the Torah. Okay, a very challenging procedure, mitzvah, and the Mishnah tractate will be no less challenging than the passage in the Torah. Okay, so the Sotah, okay, comes from the term right here in Pasuk Yud Bet, Ishish ki tiste ishto. Listot means to depart from the path. So the wife departs from the path, which means she departs from loyalty to her husband. It sounds like we know her already to be guilty. But then, as we know, she undergoes something that is akin to what scholars call an ordeal. Okay? The ordeal, as a technical term, means trial by ordeal. Okay? The criminal is put through some kind of dangerous test, and we have to see if he survives the test or dies. Interestingly, in some traditions, if you survive, it means you're guilty, and if you're killed, it means you were innocent. Okay, it's such a Christian tradition. If you die, you were innocent. Okay, and therefore you could be buried in sacred ground. Okay, whereas if you survived, you were guilty and had to be put to death and then be buried in unconsecrated ground. That's one version of it. Of course, in many versions, if you survive, then that's a sign that you're innocent. Okay, so if you're putting her through this ordeal or quasi ordeal, then it seems to indicate we're not so sure she's guilty. Okay, so that's already a kind of a conundrum that emerges from the biblical text right off the bat. And it continues in the next psukim. Again, it's describing her as guilty. Her husband was unaware. She hid, and she was contaminated. She was defiled. But there was no witness. So she's guilty, but we can't prove it in a court of law. Okay? Given all that buildup, so then the spirit of jealousy that washes over the husband, so far it seems quite justifiable because the wife indeed is guilty of infidelity. But then, surprisingly, the Torah shifts. Or perhaps, okay, this wave of jealousy washed over him and she wasn't defiled. Oh, guess what? Maybe she wasn't guilty. And maybe his jealousy is unfounded. And the Torah seems to sort of leave you scratching your head, which in my view is exactly what the Torah wants to do. I think the Torah is in a way recreating the psychology of the husband. The husband has grounds for suspicion. The grounds for suspicion reminds us of a term that we encountered repeatedly in the Mishnah at the end of Nazir. And even though the Mishnah doesn't use it for Sotah, the Talmud does. Raglayim ladavar. The husband feels he has serious grounds for suspicion. Therefore, he accuses her. But maybe not. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm reading things into the situation. I think the Torah is recreating that kind of psychological situation. So how does one resolve that? You take the woman up to the priest in the temple and you go through this quasi-ordeal. Why do I say quasi-ordeal? It's been pointed out by scholars that unlike any other trial by ordeal that we're aware of, what happens to the Sotah does not involve an inherently dangerous situation. Normally, an ordeal could be passing the person through fire, throwing the person into a body of water. Those are like standard ordeals, things that could and should be damaging to the person or even fatal. Okay, and then you see how the person handles it, survive or not. Here, what does she do? She drinks some water. Okay, the water is called bitter water. There are things mixed in with it that it's not the beverage you would like to drink when you wake up in the morning for breakfast. Okay, but it's not dangerous. Nothing in that beverage that she drinks is dangerous. But she might die. Okay, so it's in a way like the opposite of an ordeal. Okay, it's not you put the woman through a dangerous situation and see if she manages to survive. You put her into a situation that is not inherently dangerous. It's only one thing that makes it dangerous, and that is it's in the temple with a Kohen, accompanied by a sacrifice, accompanied by an oath and a curse. Okay, there are two terms. There's the term Allah. Okay, vishbiota a Kohen, that's an oath. Okay, and then it says in pasuk kaf aleph, bishvuat ha'Allah. Okay, a curse. She's standing before God. She is taking an oath. She is drinking a beverage in which, and this is a point that the Torah makes, but that Chazal emphasize even more, the most important active ingredient in this potion that she drinks is a passage from the Torah that was erased into the water. Take a scroll, write this passage from the Torah, the passage that has the oaths, okay, the oaths and the curses. You write that passage, you erase it into the water, and she drinks it. So she's not just uttering an oath and a curse, she's also imbibing the oath and the curse. So what's dangerous here? God is involved at every step of the way. It's in God's home. You are invoking God's name through the oath. You are erasing God's name into the water, and she's drinking it. That's the ordeal. Again, very, very different from any other ordeal we know from other cultures. Okay? But the whole notion of trial by ordeal seems really un-Jewish, and in fact, it's unique in the entire Torah. Ramban already noted this point, that this is a unique situation where God involves himself in order to get this situation straight. Now, why does God do that specifically in this situation? We'll leave that question hanging, okay? We could suggest answers, but let's leave the question hanging. And I think that by reading the Mishnah carefully, we can come to some answers to that question. Okay, so now let's look at some of what happens in the Mishnah. We'll start off with the first couple of Mishnayot. Here, let's do this. Okay, do you see it on the screen?
No.
No, you don't see it on the screen. Okay, let's get it up on the screen. Okay, now you should see it.
Yep.
Okay, so now the very first word of Tractate Sotah already gives a different slant to the whole procedure. Hamekane li'ishto. That word is clearly taken from the Torah. In the Torah, the husband was mekane, ruach kin'ah. Ruach kin'ah means a wave of jealousy overcame him. And then the Torah said, well, was the wave of jealousy justified, or maybe it wasn't? So bring her up to the temple and let God decide whether indeed your jealousy was justified or not. Right? That's how the Torah presents it. Hamekane li'ishto in the Mishnah is a legal procedure. The husband makes a pronouncement. Notice the translation here, a warning. The husband says to the wife, Al tisatri madam ploni. In other words, the procedure of kinui, that's the way it's normally referred to, right? Not kin'ah, which means jealousy, but kinui, to indicate that we're talking about a verb, a procedure, an action, is when the jealous husband comes to the wife and says to her, I don't want you hanging out in private with that guy. You and he, I don't like what's going on between you, so I don't want you hanging out in private with him. That is stage number one of creating a sotah, mikane li'ishto. And now comes the real kicker. Rabbi Eliezer says, mikane al pi shnayim. He has to have two witnesses to it. He cannot bring his wife up to drink the bitter waters unless when he issued this admonition to his wife, there were two witnesses. So it's not just he sits over dinner with his wife and he says to her, listen, dear, something unhealthy going on. You got to stay away from him. That's not what happened. He's already setting up a legal proceeding. Two witnesses. And in front of two witnesses, he says, I suspect you of hanky-panky with that guy. I don't want you in private with him. And two witnesses can attest that. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, but mashkel pi erechad al pi atzmo. However, once he has two witnesses to the kinui, he personally can say, she violated my admonition. He can come and say, I saw her checking into a hotel room with that guy. Or one other witness can come and say, I saw her, the hotel clerk, right, can say, I saw them check into the hotel room together. That's what produces a Nazir. And this, not a Sotah, rather. And this is what the Talmud terms raglayim ladavar. The husband can't just take his wife up to drink the bitter waters on a whim. It can't just be a wave of jealousy. After the wave of jealousy, he then has to translate that into action. He has to come to her in front of witnesses and say, don't go near that guy. And then afterwards, somebody, according to Rabbi Eliezer, one witness, and Rabbi Yoshua says, no, mashka al pi shnayim. That also has to be two witnesses. You need two witnesses for the kinui. You also need two witnesses for what's called in halacha the stira. The stira means when they checked into the hotel room together. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a hotel room. They could be in some secluded area of the park. Okay, nobody else goes. Okay, it could be down near the river late at night. Okay, when nobody else is around. According to Rabbi Yoshua, you need two people for that as well. So now I would say, I think we can all agree, the whole situation of Sotah is set up by Chazal when there's not just suspicion, but we can all see there are very strong grounds for suspicion. I think under these circumstances, any of us would be hard put to imagine that she's not guilty. But we don't have proof. We have what we would call today strong circumstantial evidence that this woman is guilty. He was suspicious of her, and we know that there were 2 witnesses to that. And she ignored his admonition and isolated herself in a secluded spot with the very same man about whom the suspicions arose. Does any of us really think she's innocent? I doubt it. Okay, so the husband is not just jealous here. Kinui is not just jealousy now. Kinui is setting up a legal situation in which the circumstantial evidence has indicated to us close to 100% this woman is almost definitely guilty. So that's the opening, right? And the second Mishnah spells this out. If he just says, don't speak with this man, and she spoke with him, nothing. But if nichnasayim olevet haseta, that's why it's called stira, that's the term in the Torah, v'nistira v'nitma. She has to hide, but she has to hide after the admonition. Okay, and then the Mishnah continues. Okay, we'll go another few minutes, and we'll leave over some points from the first 2 chapters that we'll have to fill in next time. This woman now loses her truma rights. Okay, because it says here asura leveita. Let's start here. Asura leveita, a sotah may not have relations with her husband. Again, not just because he's suspicious. It's beyond suspicion. It's because she has put herself into a situation where it seems so objectively clear that she's guilty that she's no longer allowed to live with her husband. An unfaithful wife may not live with her husband. Of course, cuts both ways. He may not live with her, she may not live with him. Basura lechol b'truma. If she's married to a Kohen, okay, she has now been disqualified from eating truma, because we consider it to be on her way out. She's not fully a wife. They can't live together. He can't eat truma. Okay. Okay. We'll just look at another couple of points in the procedure. Okay. We'll look at the second part of Mishnah Gimel. Ketzad osela. So what happens in this situation? Molicha leveitin sheboto makom. He brings her to a local court. That's already interesting. The Torah never involves the court in the Sotah proceedings. The Torah says the husband brings his wife to the temple. But here it's a court, and not only is it a court, it's a local court. Because before he even goes up to Yerushalayim, it has to be brought before a local court. Presumably, the local court is not just a rubber stamp. The local court will hear the parties out and will then say, yes, you're right. She is a sotah. And let's backtrack a bit. Elas rot milechol betruma homeret me'ani lecha. If the wife, let's say, says, you're right, I'm guilty. Or haomeret eini shotah. Or if the wife says, I don't want to go through with this. I'm not interested. Or balai no rotzel ashkotah. Or the husband says, you know what? I have enough proof. As far as I'm concerned, it's over. Then what happens? She will forever be prohibited to eat truma, and as we'll see later in the tractate, she doesn't drink. There's only one situation in which the woman will drink the bitter waters, and that is if the husband wants to go through with it and she wants to go through with it. She professes her innocence, and she says, and I'm willing to drink the bitter water to prove it. And the husband says, I'm very suspicious, but I'm prepared to give you a chance. Okay? This, by the way, this is not apologetics. This is what clearly emerges from the Mishnah. The husband brings his wife up when both of them are interested in it. Why would both of them be interested in it? Well, the rabbis basically give us the answer. They are going through this ordeal because they want to maintain the marriage. If the couple is not interested in maintaining the marriage, they won't go through with the ordeal. There's no point. All he has to do is divorce her. And by the way, we will see as we go through the tractate, she forfeits her ketubah. Since she has put herself in this very compromising position, he is entitled to divorce her without paying the ketubah. In fact, we would encourage him to divorce her under those circumstances. So there's no need for a ketubah. So that's if they don't want to go through. If one or the other party doesn't want to go through with the ordeal, that's the solution. End the marriage. Both of you go on with your lives. If and only if both the husband and the wife want to maintain the marriage, there's only one way to do it. She's got to get a clean bill of health from the Sotah ordeal. By going through the Sotah ordeal, she now has a chance to prove that despite the damning evidence, she's really innocent, in which case the marriage can be maintained. Okay, I think it's very important to keep all of that in perspective. Is that what the Torah had in mind? I wouldn't necessarily assume that to be the case. I think the pshat of the Torah does not lead us in that direction, but that's not our concern. Okay, the Mishnah clearly leads us in that direction. Okay, and one final detail that we'll look at tonight. Umosrin lo shnei talmidei. So they've come to the local court. The court examines them and says, yes, there's a basis. And if both of them want to, the court will then send them on their way to the temple. But interestingly, umosrin lo shnei talmidei chachamim. They send two talmidei chachamim with them to accompany them. Shema yavo aleha baderech, to prevent them from having relations along the way. Now, I think there couldn't be any clearer expression of the fact that as far as the Mishnah is concerned, we are talking about a couple that want to restore their marital relationship. There's not a couple that are on the outs and just can't wait to get rid of one another. Not talking about a husband who says, that's it, I've had it with this woman. And we're not talking about a woman who says, I'm not going to go through this. If this is what he wants to put me through, I'm out of here. Talking about they agree to it, and on their way up, we're afraid they might succumb and actually have relations, which they're not allowed to do until after she's passed the test. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bala Neman Aleh. He says no. The husband, okay, he may be interested in testing whether he can salvage the marriage, but not at this point. at this point, he's not interested in having relations with her. That's going too far. So we don't need Talmidei Chachamim to accompany them in order to chaperone them and make sure that nothing untoward happens along the way. By the way, if anything untoward happens along the way, then the procedure is contaminated. And we say, okay, forget it. She can't drink. There's no point. Okay, so we will close with that for this evening. There's a lot more to say about chapter 1, but we'll save that for the next class. So Erev Tov to all.
All right, thank you everyone for coming, thanks especially for this rescheduled recording date. If you are listening on the recording, you can reach out to Rabbi Walfish with questions. Rabbi Walfish, how can people get in touch with you if we have questions that we didn't have time to cover in class?
Okay, please, you can send out my email and I'll be happy to respond.
All right, thank you very much. This class will meet again on March 19th. We will not meet this coming Sunday on March 12th, May 19th. May 19th, we will not meet on May 12th. And with that, have a good day.
Thank you.
Take care.